Today's guest is Charlie Clouser. Charlie is the composer for the new film Saw X, which hits theaters everywhere as of the day this episode is dropping, and he's worked on a billion other things as well. He's toured with bands like Nine Inch Nails. He's collaborated with groups like Rob Zombie, Marilyn Manson, David Bowie, and so many more. And he's worked on a variety of movies like The Stepfather and Resident Evil Extinction, which is undisputedly the best Resident Evil movie. I will not be taking any disagreement in the comments of this video. On today's show, we talk all about the Saw franchise, which Charlie has spent, of course, 20 years of his career working on. We talk about working with different directors who've touched the franchise, and we just talk about some of Charlie's biggest inspirations and some of his favorite collaborators, including someone from Limp Bizkit. We go into it all on today's episode of Film Schooled. Don't miss a single second. Strap in and let's go. Charlie, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you on. That's an understatement. I'm very excited to have you on because Saw for me is a franchise that I am a little obsessed with. And, it's wild to think at this point we're talking about Saw 10. It's wild. And obviously every time a new movie in a franchise like this comes out, you go back to the first one and revisit it. And I was blown away looking at the credits going, okay, this is James Wan's first feature film. This is Leigh Whannell's first feature film writing credit. And then this is your first feature film that you ever composed from start to finish. And it ended up spawning a billion-dollar franchise, which is pretty amazing. Take me back to 2004 and working on Saw. I guess it would be 2003 probably. Working on Saw. Did you have any idea at the time that this is going to be a mega super hit, or was this is kind of a gruesome horror movie that'll be fun to work on and might disappear?
Well, I kind of, I love the first Saw movie, and as soon as I saw it, I thought this is something amazing. The twist ending in the first one is, a thing of legend and beauty. And the fact that it was my first feature and that it was James and Lee's first feature and that it was kind of an outsider sort of production, an indie production, that didn't really alarm me or make me think, oh, this thing will never see the light of day or whatever. That because I felt it was a super strong movie with a great cast. And I love seeing, Danny Glover's role is not typical for him in his career. And I love seeing, and same with Cary Elwes, that's not typical role for him. And I love seeing actors go kind of outside where you'd expect to see them. So I thought it was a really cool story, amazing twist, great cast, and a very gritty kind of art direction and cinematography. And it had all the kind of ingredients that I like to see in a movie. That said, you never know if something's going to find its audience, whether it's a record that you slaved on for years or a movie, or when you've done your best work and when you think something is good, but there's a million slips betwixt the cup and the lip. There's a million reasons why a movie or a record or any piece of art might not find its audience or hit the cultural zeitgeist vibe at the right angle. And I do remember at one point, as we were finishing it up, James Wan said, look, if this thing winds up going straight to DVD or something, I promise I will rent a movie theater so we can all see our names on the big screen just once before we die. Of course it opened at the Grauman's Chinese Theater in the big room. And it was now it's a global juggernaut, but you don't know if the external factors are going to scuttle the ship. When you've done good work and you hope for the best. And I won't say I'm surprised, but I'm amazed that we're still churning them out 20 years in and 10 movies in. And, we did have some breaks in the schedule for a while. It was a movie every year. And we were just cranking. It was a mad dash every year to get it into theaters for Halloween weekend. Now it's a little more relaxed of a schedule, which suits me. But I'm always amazed that it was able to really strike a chord with the fans, and it's carved out its own little weird niche within the horror and thriller genre. And I just love that fans are still on board after all these years.
you have an interesting career trajectory because you went from working in television and kind of assisting on different projects and in the music realm. Then you go to the live performance world, working with a couple bands people have probably heard of. And, you know, is there a big difference for you? Like you hear actors talk about doing theater, being in front of getting live feedback from an audience versus, you know, standing in front of a camera, they yell cut, they throw the cigarette to the side and say, we got it, let's see what happens. Which of those do you prefer? Do you prefer kind of working in the isolation and then unleashing on the world? Or do you prefer that immediate feedback from a live audience?
Well, it's funny. I never, what you just said makes me think that that's a good analogy, that like playing live on stage with bands is probably more like live theater for an actor. And composing for film or making records is probably more like making movies for would be for an actor. And I've only been asked that question before. If people say, "Oh, do you prefer working in TV series or movies?" Because those are very, even though it's the same vibe creatively, the workflow and the logistics are drastically different. Like TV is this mad dash every week, and you don't have time to overcook things. But I got to say, when I'm asked that question, I say I like them both. If I only did one, if I was just TV guy and it was always a mad dash, then I think I would miss the opportunity to overcook things like you get with a movie where there's much more time and you can spend a lot of time creating new and unique sounds just for that one project that never to be used again. And some of those kind of workflow logistical things are sort of prohibited by the schedule when working in TV. But what you were asking, I like them all. Like every phase, I've been lucky in that I've never really been stuck in a cubby hole that I didn't enjoy what it was. Although I came into all of this, whether it was making records or composing for film and TV, I came into it kind of as like the studio wizard lab rat guy who would, step aside, I'll drive the computers, that kind of thing. And that's what my skills in that world were, kind of what brought me into Trent Reznor's world for 9 Inch Nails, which morphed into me being the keyboard player in the live band, which was more fun than you can imagine, of course. But the continuous thread through all this stuff is that lab rat ethos. And I remember at one point I was asked a similar kind of question years ago, and I said, well, I'm more of a lab rat than a road dog. And then I said, oh, you know what? That's actually genius. That's the perfect description. Because when you're on tour with a band, there's a lot of hurry up and wait, to get to that 2 hours of the day when you're actually doing the thing that you're there to do. And that can be a little bit frustrating at times, especially because when I was touring, it was in the 1990s and we didn't have laptop studios like we do now. So I'd be wheeling these refrigerator sized racks into my hotel room to try to like chip away at some remix or something when we had a day off. So I kind of like all of the above, but I'm quite happy to have wound up where I wound up.
Yeah, definitely. It's got to be different too. Like you created, Saw being the first feature you're working on. You're going straight from, the 90s. You're touring with 9 Inch Nails. You've got a literal band around you that are all throwing out ideas, and there's that kind of synergy there. To then I'm sitting alone in my house, watching footage and trying to craft a score. Was that challenging, going from having that feedback from a crew to I'm going to be by myself, compose some music, and then, eventually I'll have 3 or 4 people come in to add some music to this, but this is my baby now. This is my work.
I actually quite liked that opportunity to just zoom in and focus and be the only one that I have to please on that effort, especially because as it was my first time sort of driving the ship, I had been in the co-pilot seat on a lot of film and TV scores before that, but since that was the first time that I was, grabbing the wheel, it was kind of nice to not have it be a committee type decision and to not have to second guess what I was doing, based on what I thought the other people in the room might like. I really had a very narrow path to who I had to please. It was really all about James and Lee, and to a lesser degree, the producers, who were on board with whatever James thought. And much to his credit, James's thought process is never like lacking. He's never like, I wonder what we should do here. He had a very clear set of goals, and was very articulate in what he wanted the score to do, even in that very first movie that he was directing. So that made it much easier for me to find the path to the destination, and even when making the kind of records that I was usually involved in, they weren't necessarily sort of like it wasn't like the guys in the band sitting around the campfire jamming out to Rolling Stones songs and, hey, I got a good riff here, dude. It was very similar workflow and logistics wise to what I wind up doing in this world, where we have laboratories full of blinking lights and computer screens, and there's usually one person driving while some others are saying, hey, what if we did this, or what if we did that? So it's a little closer. My experience in band world and making records was a little closer to what I'm doing now, maybe, than might be obvious.
It's really cool that James had that freedom early on. I mean, it is the tail end of the 90s, so independent filmmaking was still very big conversation. You had Robert Rodriguez cranking out movies, and Tarantino, and then New Blood being given freedom to try something is really cool. And it's another thing that's interesting too, thinking about Saw, is that, and I interviewed the cinematographer for the new film, Nick Matthews, and we were talking about, digital filmmaking was new. They're punching colors up and adding green and making things a little extra gritty and grungy. And I get that vibe from the music of the movie as well, where it's like the music feels like you want to get a tetanus shot just as much as the visuals do. It has a very unique flavor where it's very melodic and it's very beautiful, but then there's these scratching and grungy industrial sounds. Where do you even start putting that together? Because at a certain point it could just feel like noise, but it never does. It feels like music.
I'm grateful to hear that. And it's funny you say it. At some points, it could almost feel like noise, because the plan in the first Saw movie, more so than in most of the sequels, was that the score should just dissolve into noise. As the movie goes on, we sort of start gently and with a curious kind of, hey, I wonder what's on that tape deck. Then it moves through some thematic, melodic moments, getting darker and darker, with all the chord progressions moving downwards and getting heavier, until by the time we're in the third act and Dr. Gordon is struggling in the grungy, dank bathroom. Then the score dissolves into basically scraping metal sounds and banging on pots and pans, and it just barely music. On purpose, because then it shifts gears massively for the sort of ending montage reveal segment. And that's when the big melodic theme of Hello Zepp comes in, and like it's in a different key and it's using sounds that were never used in the rest of the score. So that was very much an arc that was kind of predetermined by talking with James and Lee. And so fortunately I had this kind of game plan going in. When it comes to figuring out how to make it sound like it looks on the screen, which is always my goal to some degree, I'm a huge collector and curator and creator of sounds, samples, and audio recordings, and going around with a little portable recorder and bashing on stuff and dumpster lids, trying to play a dumpster lid with a violin bow or whatever kind of silliness I can think of. And so I've been collecting sounds and samples and recordings for 40 years. And I'm also pretty meticulous about how I categorize them and how I name them, and so I can find the kind of thing I'm looking for fairly quickly. And I do have there's a lot of, put it this way, there's a lot of subfolders inside the dumpster recordings folder, so that I can find, because some of these sounds that I'm trying, I didn't want to just use strings and brass and orchestral sounds, because those, they teach you how to do that in school. And my a guiding principle for me has always been, well, if they can teach you how to do something effectively in school, then that's not something I want to focus on as much as trying to find sounds I've never heard before, put together in ways I've never heard before. So that's why I tend to be more interested in the violin bow on the dumpster lid, or the sound of, and I know I've talked about this in a million interviews, the sound of the subway cars coming into the 72nd Street station and their brakes squealing when I first moved to New York in like 83, and thinking, oh my God, that's the most amazing sound. I recorded it with my little cassette Walkman in those days. And that actual recording from 1983 has become a sound that I used in a lot of the Saw movies, because it has a whistling tonal character that sounds almost like a distant tortured string section. And, I kind of, my formative years in music and music technology were around the time when you had, Peter Gabriel making albums using the Fairlight sampler, and bands like, early Ministry records that were done on the Fairlight. And so I was always into sample manipulation and that art of noise concept of taking real world sounds and turning it into music. And so I do have a big archive and collection of stuff that I'm building up, even when I'm not working or don't have a project in mind. And then I do have a lot of weirdo instruments from which I can coax that type of sound, like these bowed metal instruments over in the corner, and these weird sort of steampunkish hurdy-gurdy guitar type things, and just anything that's a little left of center in terms of where the sound is coming from is what I gravitate towards. And, despite my heritage as a synthesizer guy, involved with Nine Inch Nails and other synth heavy type of things, most of the sounds in my scores are not synthesizers. And I use very few actual synths, because I kind of know, and this might, maybe everybody else thinks this too, but when I hear a sort of synth sounds, I think, well, I know how that was done. I know what that is. I don't know if it's a Moog or an Oberheim, but it's a familiar sound, much to me, the same way that strings and woodwinds are. And so I'm much more interested in using sounds that have an emotional sort of undercurrent, but they're not immediately identifiable as to what the source was, and that's been, fortunately, the Saw movies are perfect for that they do want the music to sound rusty and dusty and crusty. And another kind of concern whenever I'm creating sounds or picking the sounds I'm going to use in a score is that I very much want the score to sound of a place with what I'm seeing on the screen. So if the scene is taking place in some dank dungeon where a hapless victim is in a jigsaw trap, doesn't feel right to me to use, epic sounding movie taiko drum ensemble, because to me that sounds like the Riders of Rohan coming over the hill on horseback. It's an outdoors sound. It's big and it signifies grandeur. And so having those kind of like mental criteria and guidelines in place makes it a little easier for me to pick a subset of my sound collection to use as a starting point in something like Saw, because I'll be flipping through my sounds and going, no, that sounds like it's outdoors. No, this sounds like it's epic and big, and I need claustrophobia and wetness and darkness and undergroundness. And so I'm always thinking in those kind of terms as I develop the sound palette for any of these scores.
Yeah, I think that's the appeal of Saw all these years later is, there's nothing in Saw. I mean, and there were plenty of movies, and I mean, you even worked on some like The Collection and that series, like that were obviously influenced heavily by that aesthetic, but I never saw anything, a Hostel, fill in the blank. They all, and even the ones that did a good job doing what they were doing, Saw just feels so experimental. Even now, like there's things that they do with the camera and transitions and of course the twists that it's become iconic for, that just feel like people who are extremely talented just playing and trying really new things. Sometimes those things don't work, but 9 times out of 10, they work really, really well and in really interesting ways. And I was thinking as I was preparing for this interview of iconic horror movie soundtracks. I'm a big horror guy. That's my genre. Like that's what I love. And all of my favorite horror soundtracks, I mean, and the Saw theme, I think, is a top 10 horror soundtrack. And I've talked to many people who would agree with me on that. You know, they're all ones that have done something very different. I mean, even The Exorcist that, you know, had a soundtrack that it used, it's coming from an instrument you're going, what is this? Like Tubular Bells doesn't sound human. You know, if you listen to, I mean, even if you listen to Friday the 13th, you know, the taking of dialogue and, you know, running it through and doing the throughout the series, brilliant things that are purely experimental and don't sound like traditional orchestral music. And I think that's always fascinating. And it's the stuff that holds that, you know, no matter what passage of time there is, it's always interesting because it's not tied to, this sounds super 80s or super 90s or super early 2000s. It has no time, you know.
And that what you're talking about is part of what drew me into not just making film music, but just music in general was, you know, I clearly remember seeing The Shining and 2001: A Space Odyssey in theaters as a child, you know, and you know, I grew up not having like an older brother that was turning me on to Led Zeppelin records or whatever. My parents were a bit older and like they listened to Dixieland jazz and that sort of thing. So I didn't really have I wasn't steeped in.
It's a clear influence on your work, Dixieland jazz.
Yeah. Preservation Hall, you can hear it in the Saw theme. So as a result, I didn't have like a huge musical vocabulary when I was, you know, like 7 years old or whatever.
Sure.
Because I wasn't hearing like, you know, Dokken coming out of my older brother's room or whatever. But that made me more kind of receptive to when I first heard the music of like Gheorghe Ligeti and Bartok and Penderecki and stuff in the context of those Kubrick movies. That's really triggered massive curiosity on my part. I was like, okay, I understand that these Ligeti choral pieces, I understand that it's human voices, but I've never heard a choir like that. I've never heard them do that before. But it wasn't just a pure technical curiosity. It was just the sheer emotional impact of some of those alternative techniques, whether it's those, you know, to me, those choirs that in the Ligeti pieces as used in 2001, like that is the sound of the unknown and the unknowable to my young mind. And it still kind of is today, 40 years later. And similarly with the music in The Shining, that clattering, you can tell that it's was made with an orchestra, but they're not playing their cellos correctly. They're doing something bad to their cello. And those clattering percussive effects from the string orchestra and the kind of dissonant and atonal aspects to those arrangements that used what is quote normal unquote orchestral instruments, that's what really sparked huge curiosity. And to me, it sounded like somebody losing their mind in The Shining. And I thought, that's amazing that music can work this way. Because as a kid, like, you know, the hearing, I wasn't exposed to a huge vocabulary of outsider or experimental music. It was sort of like, okay, Indiana Jones, bop, ba, ba, bop. Okay, that's it's the perfect music for that. But it wasn't like some bolt from outer space that amazed and shocked my young mind, like the stuff in Kubrick movies was, and the Bernard Herrmann music in the Hitchcock movies too. Even though it's quote normal instruments unquote, it's been kind of hit with a sledgehammer and it's knocked on. It's a little crooked. And those were the things that intrigued me and made me curious about music and sound that, you know, very early in life, that kind of helped to spur my curiosity to try to find similar things that had that kind of effect.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned Bernard Herrmann because I was thinking as we were talking about Psycho, and Psycho actually came up in conversation. I was talking to somebody about the first Saw movie just recently. And I said, it's very similar to Psycho in the way that a lot of the scenes are constructed. The sequels get and I love both. I love the gory, like, let's go as hard as we can in this direction. And the first Saw, I love that there's really not that much gore, even though you feel like you saw a lot. And I think that's the similarity to Psycho is when you watch that shower scene, you always feel like I just saw a knife go through that woman, and you didn't. You never did. Right. And same with Saw. I feel like I saw those razors cutting through that guy's skin. I feel like I saw this thing.
It's all about the lead up to that terrible, the whole movie is a lead up to the horrible 7 seconds that the hacksaw is actually used.
It's just going like this for 2 seconds. There's a little bit of blood, and you feel like you've watched this gruesome thing. And it's these fast cuts like Psycho, and then the music is telling you, like Bernard Herrmann's score, even though it is traditional violins and string instruments, it's such a high pitch, it feels like the sound of a knife cutting. It feels like you're there. And same with Saw. Before I move into kind of the rest of the franchise and how you've built on it, what was that line between sound effect versus music? Like, did you ever feel like you were stepping on the toes of the sound designer? Did you ever feel like this would be better without music? Did you ever feel like, let's kind of work on this together and kind of amp up some of these sounds? Like, what was that process like? Because there's a lot of crossover in this type of music.
That it can be a bit of a juggling match. Especially in some of the sequels in the Saw franchise, where there's big, heavy machinery involved in the traps. So there'd be this sort of mechanical, and so there in those kind of troublesome scenes, there has to be some kind of back and forth where I'm trying to steer the sounds that I'm using away from the frequency spectrum of what the sound design is, the sound effects is going to be.
Because it's almost like a metronome at times. So it's like,
if there is, I would love it if the sound design for the trap machinery could be used as the basis for a beat that would form the backbone of the score cues. That usually hasn't happened because the sound effects need to be directly in sync to what's on screen. And then they cut for perspective. So if the camera's not looking directly at the loud part of the machine, then that sound effect is quieter when we cut to the victim's face or whatever. So that hasn't been as much of an opportunity as I thought it might be getting into some of these sequels. In the first Saw movie, there wasn't nearly as much of that because there wasn't some giant, arm grinder machine that was clanking away in the background. So I had more of a free rein to use those type of sounds in the score to help to create that illusion. I mean, in that whole ending sequence in the original Saw, it's just two guys handcuffed to pipes in a bathroom. There's nothing, no impending doom coming at them other than the situation. So that allowed me to just amp up what I was doing in the music and have all these scraping and grinding and sawing type of sounds because they weren't already present on the screen. And so I was able to, unleash the full weight of that in the score without having to steer around the sound design. Although in some of the sequels I have had to be much more conscious of trying not to have it be a pig pile on the finish line of, well, we got all these drum sounds that sound like clanking machines, and then we have this sound of the clanking machine. What are we going to do? So there's a bit of a tap dance, but you get better at it as the decades go by.
Sure. Yeah, everything gets bigger and louder and more gruesome as the series goes on. The traps get far more elaborate. It is interesting, again, going back to that first one and going, there's the reverse bear trap, which is, obviously, it's plenty gruesome when you think about what the implication is of that. But you have a couple smaller traps in comparison to what we get later on. And then on top of that, Jigsaw's becoming more iconic in each one. The music is expected in each one. I have to imagine there's like a sense of responsibility of like, when do I hit into that music? Or if I do a certain type of music, is it going to give away something that's going to be coming because they come to expect that? It's going to paint someone as a villain we don't know as a villain yet. Like, how did the score evolve while also maintaining its same traits and things throughout the series? How did you evolve in approaching it so it could get bigger and better and louder while also not, not just being there, not just being inserted the same way in every movie?
Well, it's always, I mean, I'm super grateful that that piece of music called Hello Zepp in the first film has become like the sort of the trademark of the franchise and like the signal that the audience needs to pay attention now, because now we're in the twist ending reveal montage. And I do remember working on even working on the very first one, it was in discussion with James, it became clear that it was important that whatever this piece of music that occurs there, it needed to be bold, yes, but also simplistic in a way. It couldn't be some elaborate symphony, because there's a lot of information coming flying at the audience. There's rapid, fast cuts of picture with some flashbacks to earlier scenes. In some cases, those shots are longer than what was revealed earlier in the movie, or they're from a different angle. So there's more information for the viewer to parse. And there's also a voiceover that's sort of narrating what has led us all to this final moment. And so I knew that piece of music it wanted to be interesting and hooky. So it couldn't just be brah, brah. It had to have some thematic and melodic element and an arc that builds in intensity, and it's rising in pitch as the piece progresses and getting more and more frantic. So I was lucky that we were able to establish those kind of goals or ground rules before I even started writing it. So I knew that it had to be bold but simple so that it wouldn't distract the audience. And they weren't like, oh, listen to how the string part is changing and morphing as the piece goes on. Like, the changes that occur as the piece develops needed to be simplistic enough that they wouldn't go ignored, but they also wouldn't cause the audience to scratch their heads and start paying attention to the music too much. And at the same time, it couldn't just be a drone or a loop. It had to have this, building structure to it. And fortunately, that was ironed out in discussion with James, like before I even began writing the piece of music. The actual writing of the piece of music took an afternoon. I mean, it's kind of shame to admit it now, but I was very fortunate that once I had those criteria in mind, I just and I also knew that it wanted to be in a different key to all the rest of the music in that film, so that it sounded like somebody just walked in the room and switched on the lights. Different sort of character to the sounds that are much more dry and kind of up front and in your face. The rest of the score is kind of murky and distant with lots of reverb on it. So I had these criteria and this sort of roadmap to what I needed to do. And I was lucky that I didn't have to beat my head against the keyboard for too long to come up with the riffs and the melody and the structure. And it all just kind of fell into place. Of course, I had no idea we'd be doing 10 of these movies as the years went by. And with each iteration in the franchise, that Hello Zepp piece is not only expected, it's like required, and it's very much not an accident where it occurs and where the sections change and where the sort of quiet breakdown bit with the mournful melody and where it kicks back in. All that stuff is agonized over in the editing bay, and the picture editors and the director and the producers will usually give me some Frankenstein hack job version that they've cut together that of all of the previous Zepps that have existed, and they Frankenstein something together that works against picture. And then I kind of have to back into that and figure out how to make it sound like the edits make sense and that the music flows organically and isn't some hack job.
That's funny. You're your own temp music. That's a interesting
in that case
place to be.
I kind of am. Although even especially on this last one, there's always a section somewhere in the middle that's from something else that they've jammed in there, and they say, I don't know how you're going to do this, but we found this other piece, and like it starts off as Hello Zepp, and then it flips into this other thing, and we just kind of like the way this mood went, and then it comes back. So there's always a bit of a little bit of reverse engineering, and then a little bit of head scratching. And it was funny in this, the piece they used in the temp score in Saw X for this middle segment of where Hello Zepp now lives was a piece from a production library music or something. It wasn't from another movie score. And it was, I won't tell you what the title of that piece of music was in this production music library, but from the sound of it and from the title of it, it was clear that it was a tribute or an homage to Hello Zepp itself. So they used a Hello Zepp ripoff as an extra piece to extend the length of the temp music in Saw X. And it was kind of, Kevin, the director, we had a good laugh over that. He was like, this is clearly a reverse engineered version of one of the earlier Hello Zepps, but we liked the way the drums fell, and we couldn't find a piece of Hello Zepp that had the drums doing this, so we just used this. And
students become the master.
Exactly. So. But I'm also, at one point I was having this conversation with someone, and I was talking about how it's absolutely critical that like that little jingly dulcimer that happens at the beginning of the piece of music, it has to be that exact one. It can't be like a simulation or like, oh, I got a better dulcimer sound, I'll use that one. It has to be, it's like Darth Vader's breathing. It has to be the recording from 1977 or it doesn't work. It can't be something close. It can't be a better enhanced version. It has to have the original actual audio waveform. It has to be the crusty, dusty, musty version from 20 years ago, because then it's sort of a signal to the audience, like okay, here we go. We're in the home stretch. Now, everybody pay attention because this will be on the test.
Right. One of the things that's clear from everything I've seen, and I'm very excited to see the film next week when it comes out. But one of the things that seems clear from the trailer and from even conversation I've had that, with people kind of looking at where it seems to be heading, this is very much from John Kramer's POV. A lot of the film, it is in the movies throughout the series that have focused on John. He's an interesting character because you've got someone who, in his mind, believes he is doing the right thing. He thinks he's in the right, which is what makes him a compelling character. He truly believes he's the hero of the series. And what I appreciate about the series is that when showing his perspective, it lets you empathize with him to where, like any good villain, you're going, he's got a point. He's got a point, in this spot, even though he's clearly does not. There's clearly some wrongdoing happening here, to put it lightly. But I'm curious approaching the music for this. This seems like it's going to be the most time we ever spend with John Kramer in a Saw film. Did you focus more on kind of the melodrama, the kind of sympathy for John throughout the score, as opposed to when we're in the victim's POV and the score is just attacking us, through the runtime?
Right. I absolutely did spend a lot more. There's a lot more time in the movie in Saw X is spent creating a sympathetic angle to John Kramer's struggles, and so sort of the first third of the movie is like, are we even watching a Saw movie? Is this just another movie with Tobin Bell in it? Because the whole arc of the first act is building his backstory, and through the music building, enhancing that sympathetic view, because he's going through some stuff and trying to find a way out that doesn't involve murder and revenge. That's how it starts. Of course, it all goes horribly wrong. But so unlike most of the Saw movies, you're correct that we're putting the viewer in the position of, you might be the next victim. And so John Kramer's character is often only heard through the distorted tape decks or over a PA speaker, or, he's at some remove. And then which works because it's even more sort of alarming and special when he all of a sudden he's in the same room with the victims. When that does happen, then it's like, oh, now we're in real trouble. however, in this movie, the whole plot line of the entire film relies on establishing and explaining how he got to where he is. And at the risk of sympathizing for a mad villain, psychotic serial killer character in these movies, it does paint a very sympathetic picture, or at least it explains how he got there, how he got to where he is as Jigsaw. And so the music is I mean, there's sort of hopeful, wistful moments in the score. There's mournful cello melodies. There's distant solo female vocals singing wistful little wisps of melody. And then there's his brain cancer is cured and it's a bright new day, and he wakes
roll
up
credits.
In the morning.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's like there's not quite Spielberg moments, but there's like, I did have to inject this sort of rush, this like a wave of warmth and positive feeling into his story, through the use of like big warm chords and big comfortable sounds that I never use in a Saw score. And it's not so much a misdirect because we know what's coming,
right?
But it helps to reinforce that path that his character takes. And of course, it does go horribly wrong, and it goes very badly for all parties on screen. And yes, the music helps to do that as well. But it was fun to do things that were a little out of character or unexpected within the vocabulary of a Saw movie, you know?
Right. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear it, and I keep checking Spotify here and there for like, where's the soundtrack? And we were talking right before hitting record that should be coming soon. And it seems like the biggest no-brainer. They need to do a physical release, because I would love to see a vinyl like Saw blade. I think that would be the way to do it. But
and Lakeshore has been a great. Lakeshore Entertainment, Lakeshore Records has put out all of the Saw scores so far, except for some tap dancing around the first couple. But once they kind of got on board, they've been a reliable partner at that, and they're very good about getting it. I mean, I just handed it into mastering a week ago. But with any luck, it will hit the streaming services on the day of theatrical release on the September 29th, maybe a day or two later, but it's not going to be like a month from now.
Yeah.
It's in the pipeline and it's coming. And also Lakeshore has been great about fan service in terms of doing those physical releases. And like we did the Saw anthology a few years back, which was 4 vinyl records with a movie. Each movie this is when we had 8 movies in the franchise, with the score from each movie condensed down to fit on a single vinyl side. So through the course of 4 pieces of vinyl with 2 sides each, you get the entire journey in the correct chronological order of the best bits of the score from all of the movies. And they're great. They know that this isn't the kind of record that's going to move Taylor Swift numbers. This is fan service. This is for the collector and the fan, and the people, the completionists, who want to complete their Saw collection, but also for the curious and for the musically curious that want to be able to hear under the hood of that music without the tortured screams of the victim being louder than that. So I'm really pleased that Lakeshore has been so supportive over the years of releasing these things, even though we know we're not printing money off of the Saw score releases, but it's strictly a fan service effort on our part to make sure that as much as possible gets out into the world, so that not only for like the musicians and tech geeks that want to hear how the sounds were put together, whatever, but also just for the fan who, God forbid, might want to listen to that music while studying or cleaning house. I can't imagine, but they say that happens. So
yeah. No, I've listened to the Hello Zepp theme from that anthology so many times just in the last couple of weeks, just as I was thinking through questions for this, I was kind of going through it, and then it's like it's just a cool piece of music, but it is, yeah, it's a funny one to throw on. Like it's not one you just put on, smoke a cigar, and relax
Right.
to. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I gotta ask you, it's always refreshing when people who are working on these are legitimate fans of the series, and it sounds like you certainly are.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious from your perspective. I know you're promoting a movie, so I know you got to say the answer is always, it's this one. It's the one we're working on right now. Is my favorite. For you, what's your favorite? What's your favorite entry in the franchise? And beyond that, and we can go into spoilers here. What's your favorite twist ending at the throughout the franchise? Except for obviously the newest one. If that is, then we can keep that one under wraps. But what's your favorite film and favorite use of the music in a twist sequence?
I think one of my favorite, as I've been going through the scores to compile like the anthology and this and that, and also just to remind myself, what did I do when this situation occurred in Saw 4 or whatever. I think my favorite score from all of them is from Saw 2, because that was sort of a surprise. I didn't, after the, and this, to the answer to the second part, is my favorite twist ending, the first one. It's the king. Long live the king. But the music for the second one and the whole experience of doing Saw 2 was a lot of fun and was unexpected, because after seeing the twist ending in the first one, I thought, well, this was a fun movie. There's no way we're ever doing a sequel, because like the whole movie was about that twist ending. And I guess this is why would not make a good Hollywood screenwriter, because I could not envision how they would then build a universe around this character after that. After the way the first movie ended, I thought, well, that was an amazing journey, and it's over now. So see you guys around. And of course, after the success of the first one, immediately the ingenious minds of James and Lee and their writing collaborators figured out ways to morph and extend and build on the world of John Kramer, and even to take side streets like the Spiral from the Book of Saw, which is sort of like this, a blind alley that you take a hard right off of Saw Avenue and go down Spiral Alley. And that kind of ingeniousness in the screenwriting and in the story building has presented all kinds of cool opportunities from a musical standpoint. So I'll say favorite twist ending, first one. Favorite score to work on, and in terms of its results, second one, partly because I had more time and had collaborators like Wes Borland from Limp Bizkit. Yeah, I know. Well, he's one of the most amazing guitar players and guitar scientists and sonic scientists ever.
And gave us the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack. So come on.
he's the best. I unashamedly am a huge fan. And over the course of the franchise, there's been many sort of deviations from the center lane as different directors come into the franchise, with different visual styles that affects how I approach the music. Like Darren Bousman's style, a lot of times it almost has a sort of gothic and grandeur kind of way in which he constructs shots and how he lights things. And I remember one of the scenes in one of the movies that he directed reminded me of that scene in the original Silence of the Lambs movie, after Sergeant Pembry brings the dinner to Hannibal in the cage in the basketball court, and Hannibal does bad things, and Pembry's, I don't know if it was Pembry or his other deputy, is strung up on the cage and lit from behind, and it's sort of this rays of light coming out. And that kind of, to me, that, I don't know if gothic is the right word, but that kind of powerful imagery was something that Darren does in his movies within the Saw franchise, but that other directors don't quite do in the same way. So that affects, like on those movies, I would wind up using sort of big meaty choir sounds and ascending chord progressions and leaning into that imagery from the music standpoint. And I sort of couldn't help myself. Like that was what I was seeing on the screen, and it was the natural way to reinforce that was to use musical techniques that I wouldn't have used in a film that with another director who didn't construct his shots that way.
Yeah, yeah. Darren brings in a lot of that kind of noir quality too. Like he really hit that, which is throughout all the Saw series, but that detective, like, here's the police station, here's the, like, he really plays up on those shadows and things. You know, for Kevin, who's edited all of these movies, obviously he's had a big touch on the visuals of these throughout and the way they're paced and how he assembles the twists so they do make sense without you having to rewind it 30 times to go, whose brother of what cousin is that? You know, is incredible. Obviously incredibly talented. What do you feel like are his kind of trademarks as a director that you really latch onto versus, say, Darren or James or the others who have had their fingerprints on the franchise?
Well, I think Kevin's very much an aficionado of the grit, both in the cinematography and the color grading and just the way he lights things and shoots things, but also in the performances he coaxes out of the actors. Like, he wants to see the rough edges. Even if they are an attractive person, he wants to see the less flattering angle, and he wants to see them at the end of their rope because their character is at the end of their rope in a lot of scenes. And that's something that if I were an actor, I would love that, because I'd be like, good, make me look ugly and desperate.
The snot crying is, yes, let's go.
Exactly. And, you know, that's what makes that's what makes these films feel more extreme. And these characters are in deep trouble. So you want their performances and their look to be at the extreme. And also Kevin's pacing and the way he structures, especially trap sequences, the way he edits is extremely rhythmic, and it makes it, because he knows that this wants to feel like an inevitable march towards doom, and that it wants to get faster and faster. And now, of course, that's not rocket science, that some scene like a trap sequence would have the edits getting faster and faster as we get closer and closer to the blade coming down or whatever. But he's very methodical and rhythmic about how he constructs those sequences. So it makes it that much easier for me to find that internal rhythm with the music, and to be able to also have this relentless pulse that then is getting faster and faster and faster to sometimes ridiculous amounts. Like, if you look at my audio workstation, and you see that some cues might start at like 108 beats per minute. And then by the end, they're at 170, just hammering away. And it's a gradual ramp with some sudden jumps and then some gradual increases. And those kind of extremes are not something I usually can or even would do in other types of movies. But to make them work requires that the editor also be thinking in those lines. And Kevin is amazing at that. And, you know, as I was saying earlier, the way in which he coaxes the kind of desperation out of his actors to put their characters at the end of the rope. I mean, that always reminds me of, you know, that when you said, oh yeah, ugly snot crying is the best. Well, this is why I give Gwyneth Paltrow a pass. I know, but two amazing performances. Wes Anderson's Royal Tenenbaums. She gives a very muted performance, except in this one scene when she's up in the tent in the attic with Richie Tannenbaum, and she's adopted, but they think they're in love, and it's forbidden. And she does the Gwyneth Paltrow ugly cry just for 10 seconds. Richie, delivers a line, and she does the full face scrunch and ugly cry in the same way that she does in the movie Seven, when she's sitting in the cafe with Morgan Freeman's character. And, he says, if you decide to have that child, you spoil that kid every chance you get. And then they cut to her and she just goes, and those moments of desperation or end of the ropeness are what I'm always looking for. That's what makes me think she's great at that. And I love seeing that in other actors and other characters. And there's plenty of it in Saw movies. And I think Kevin has been great at coaxing that out of his actors.
Yeah. For people that are listening, Charlie just lit one of her candles in the background, so he's a big fan of Gwyneth Paltrow. No, I love those moments, and it is a interesting thing because watching some of the scenes, there's the same thing in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the 2003 version, which I'm a pretty big fan of as well. I think it's an underrated movie. There's a moment where I forget the actor's name, but where J. Lee Ermey has the gun in his mouth and he's crying and he kind of throws up a little bit while he's crying, and it's like how do you even play that scene? Like, how do you put yourself in the mental spot to be like, what would I do if a buzzsaw is coming toward my head, or J. Lee Ermey who's already terrifying on his own, has a gun in my mouth and is about to shoot me in a van filled with my friends. It's really interesting, and it speaks to the actors to be able to pull that off. It
makes me wonder if it was just a sort of happy accident that occurred on set, and they're like, oh, well, that's the take we got to use. You almost puked when the gun went in your mouth. He's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't know what happened. Yeah. And they probably said, no, that's the one we're using.
It was craft services. I'm sorry, I don't know.
I got food poisoning from the shrimp skewers at lunch.
But I love those, and as much flack as horror gets, the performances in those moments, and there's some bad acting in a lot of horror movies, so let's get that out of the way. But some of the best performances come from that world, and be able to push to the limits in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like Shelley Duvall in The Shining, which famously was pushed beyond her limit by Kubrick's insistence on multiple takes and just driving her to the edge of madness. But that portrayal is one of the most. I mean, it's freaking legendary, and you are right there with her on her, journey to desperation. And I don't know how much of it was acting and how much of it was just her being terrified of Stanley and the whole situation. But whatever it is, the result is terrifying. So that's another example of somebody at the edge of madness and desperation, on screen.
Yeah. I love that. Love that. Well, I know we're getting near the end. I want to ask you some questions. Ask everybody that comes on the show. Even though I could probably ask another 6 hours of Saw questions, I know you have other things in life than doing that. But I like to ask these of everybody just to get the variety of answers. First and foremost, what do you think is the best representation of you as a creator? This can be anything from the work you did touring and be on albums, to doing TV, to doing movies. What project do you think best represents you as a creator?
It's funny that it's a movie that I don't even think it came out in theaters, and I don't even have a DVD copy of it. It's the second movie I ever scored on, that I got the gig on the strength of the first Saw movie, and it's called Deep Water. And it stars Lucas Black, who I loved as the young child in the movie Sling Blade, which I thought was an amazing movie, amazing performances. Lucas Black, Peter Coyote, and it's a psychological thriller. And it was my second film, but I wasn't in a hurry. I had a fairly luxurious schedule, and I just did much more. I had the time to do more wild sound design and experimentation in how the music was assembled and what the ingredients were. And it may be available on DVD somewhere in the reaches of the archives of Amazon.com, but it was one of the best creative experiences that I had. And it was, again, the score for that is barely music. There's all kinds of wild experimentation. There's circuit bent and malfunctioning toy instruments. There's whole percussion tracks that were built by tapping on guitars with pencils and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of non-string orchestra kind of stuff. And when I listen back to it, I go, you know what? That's, out of all the things I've done, that's one of my favorites. And it represents a broader spectrum of sonic experimentation than even a Saw movie, and was a much more subtle story and with fewer action scenes. And so it lets the music kind of come to a slower boil, if that makes sense. And every time I listen to that, I think, I wonder if this thing ever came out. And it's called Deep Water with Lucas Black, if you can find it. And maybe the score is out there somewhere. I'm not even sure. It was about 20 years ago, but that's one of my favorites. of all the things I've done.
I'll have to seek that out. If you were given the green light to work on any remake of a film, if you could rescore or like approach a score in a different way for a new take on a film, what would you choose?
Oh, ooh, boy. I mean, I'd like to say Seven, but Howard Shore's score cannot be topped. It is absolutely perfect. And it is the template for, I mean, I wish I could ape his techniques more often and more effectively in the work that I do, because the way in which he conjures up this sense of menace in his score for Seven without using like big pounding drums and crazy sounds. It's mostly just brass, just these mournful low brass chords and some dissonance and some atonality. But I can't say that I'd like to do a remix of Seven or a remake of Seven, because I wouldn't come within 1,000 miles of that. That's sort of like doing a cover version of Pink Floyd or Kraftwerk or Led Zeppelin or Devo. Just don't do it. Just stay away. Stay away. So I would have to say, I would, if I was going to rescore or be involved in a remake of anything, I would have to say I would love to do one of the political thrillers from the 70s, like Parallax View or 3 Days of the Condor, those kind of movies that have an intensity of impending trouble or doom, but they weren't strictly action movies, but there was this ominous sense of dread of what the main character was about to uncover. And so, that's a genre which is kind of thin on the ground. It had its heyday in the 70s, that gritty political thriller. But I always watch those movies and think, wow, this is such a great film, great writing, great performances, and great kind of introspective claustrophobic scores. And I refer to those a lot.
Yeah, I really love movies like that, and it's 80s, but I love like Blowout, like that, which is what I was picturing when you said you ran around with a microphone, like recording sounds. I was like, you're John Travolta in Blowout. But you know, those movies that feel really big, even though they're really small stories with one or two people, that would be interesting. Yeah. What is a film that people would be surprised to know that you enjoy?
I guess the obvious answer would be Barbie, but I haven't seen it yet, so I can't use that one. Surprised that I enjoy. Well, I already broke out the political thrillers from the 70s that I watch over and over again, but and in that vein, there was a film that not too many people, it didn't set the world on fire. It was maybe 10 years ago or so, but I gravitated towards it because I felt it had a lot in common with those political thrillers from the 70s that I loved so much. And it was called The International. And it starred Clive Owen and Naomi Watts and Armin Mueller-Stahl. And it was directed by Tom Tykwer. And it's a political thriller with, the kind of thing that is like a boring grown-up movie. Interpol agents hot on the trail of an international banking syndicate that's funding wars. Oh boy, sounds like fun.
Yeah, right.
But it is an action movie and a political thriller. There's an amazing, ridiculous shootout with machine guns that takes place in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which they built a replica of the interior to do it. But and it is such a great performance, the storyline is, it's a political thriller, crooked bankers, whatever. But the portrayals by Clive Owen, he's, again, a man at the end of his rope, like in many horror movies. He can't get anyone to listen to him. He's an Interpol agent. He can't get anyone to listen to, he's got the information and nobody cares, And Naomi Watts plays another investigator that's sympathetic and helps him uncover this dastardly plot. But it's great. I've always been a Clive Owen fan, and I love seeing him like kind of unhinged, unshaven, with a rumpled raincoat running through New York City in the rain, chasing a taxi cab with the bad guy in it or whatever. And the movie is I like the movie so much that I figured, I looked up, I wanted to know who did this music, because the music I think is absolutely fantastic. And I remember talking to my agent and saying, I just saw this movie that I love it. I want to do movies like that someday. And he said, what's it called? I said, oh, it's called the International. And he said, oh, I heard about this. Yeah, I heard the story was that they had a composer and he worked on it for like a year and then they fired him and then they hired Ramin Djawadi and he did it in 2 weeks. And I thought, if Ramin did that score in 2 weeks, then I quit. I'm retired. Screw this, because that score is amazing. And then my agent's on the phone with me and he goes, oh, wait, I think I'm thinking of something else. And he looked it up and he went, oh, no, I'm thinking of something else. This movie, it's Tom Tykwer, who's also a musician and composer. And it's Reinhold and Johnny, who did Run Lola Run. Remember that movie, which is another Tom Tykwer movie. Reinhold and Johnny in collaboration with the director, Tom. And it took them a year and they like flew all over the world to record orchestra in Istanbul and all this stuff. And I was like, okay, that's fine.
Okay, you can keep working.
I'm unretired now. But I like that movie and that score so much that I actually, and this is like the only time I've ever done this, I actually like asked all my friends, does anybody know this guy Reinhold? I want to ask him what are the ingredients in that score? Because there's great suspense cues that are nothing but a timpani being muted with the hand and going like boom, 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 boom. And then a little synthesizer comes in, just going boop, 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 boop. Very minimalist, but like so engaging and such great tension building, both in the movie and in the score. And I actually looked, asked all my friends, does anybody know this guy Reinhold? I want to find this guy. And turns out we come from a very similar background with synths and working with bands and stuff. And we become great friends in the intervening years. And he never did tell me exactly what the ingredients were to those cues either. So
one of these days.
Exactly.
What do you think you mentioned 70s political thrillers, so maybe that's your answer. Best decade of film history? We rocking with 70s?
I'm going to have to go. Yeah. I'm going to have to go slight tilt 67 through 77, maybe just knock it back by 3 years. There's so many films in that era that felt unpolished and gritty the way life felt. Because that's when I was like, and again, this is probably because that was my formative years. I was born in 63. So when I was, in 73, I was 10 years old and I was devouring every grown-up movie, quote unquote, that I could find. And I just love the look of movies like All the President's Men, it just feels like the real world. It doesn't feel like some polished high res 4K digital fantasy. And I appreciate those movies as well. My wife is deep into the live action One Piece series and it looks amazing and beautiful, but I love the grit and the grime on the screen. And so all of those movies, whether it's, Godfather or Mean Streets or any of those kind of movies that just had this scraped feel to them. That's my favorite era, I think.
Yeah, love that. Who do you think is the most underrated artist working today?
Ooh. I don't know if it's underrated. I would have said maybe underappreciated would have been the late Johan Johansson and his apprentice Hildur. And her score for Joker, I thought was just ridiculously great and fantastic and minimalist. And everything I've heard that Johan had done before he died was similarly just amazing to me. Minimalist, but super powerful. Although since Hildur won the Oscar, I guess she's not really underrated or underappreciated. There's another couple of guys, a two-man composing team named Danny Bensi and Sonder Jurians, who have done, I believe they did Ozark. They've done a lot of the projects that Jason Bateman produces. A movie called The Gift, I think they scored.
Love that movie. So good.
Which terrifying psychological thriller.
And very contained and simple, but super effective.
4 people in the cast or whatever, and terrifying performance from Joel Edgerton, like where he doesn't have any eyelashes and it's like this weird, but and I've heard a few of the scores they've done. There was a Jason Bateman series based on a Stephen King book. I think it was an HBO series. I think it was called The Outsider, maybe. It was like 6 or 10 episodes, a short run type of thing. and also Danny and Saunders. And their scores are, they're not like pyrotechnics. It's not like explosions of drum mania. It's super minimalist and super contained. But that kind of music is often extremely difficult to get it right, because you can't just keep piling stuff on until it works. And so when I hear their minimalist scores, also the scores by Mark Corvin, who did The Lighthouse and The Black Phone and a few others, it's super minimalist and super effective. And I know from my own half-assed attempts to do that type of music that it's a lot harder than it appears at first. So when guys like that get it right, whether it's Hilder or Mark Corvin or Danny and Saunders, I think that's where these guys are at the top of their game, and I really appreciate what they do.
Yeah. Well, last two questions here. If you had to program a double feature with Saw 10, what would you program it with?
Let's see. I'd say, okay, Saw 10 would have to come second. And the first movie would be, oh, geez, that's a tough one. Because you don't want to put something like 7 up there that's going to make us look bad, but you also don't want to put something like, you don't want to put, The Hills Have Eyes or something that's going to, by the time they get to Saw 10, they'll be exhausted. So I would, boy, that is a tough one. I would put maybe Tarantino's Grindhouse trilogy because there's horror elements, but it's good, dumb fun. And the stakes aren't all that high, because, it's kind of, the other day I just watched Machete Kills, which is so ridiculous and over the top and just silly, but awesome. And I can only imagine, it's got Mel Gibson in it and, a cast of luminaries. And I can only imagine all of those actors going, when it's explained that, yeah, Danny Trejo is going to be driving a bulletproof armor coated El Camino, and it goes through a tunnel under the border wall. You think, I'm in. You don't even have to pay me,
Right. How much do I pay you to be in this?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why, and I have a deep love for those genre picks in the exploitation series, all the Pam Grier movies from the 70s, all this. I love all that stuff. And that's why I was so glad to see, Jackie Brown, which I thought is a movie which could not be improved upon. Like, I can't find one thing wrong with it. And even though that's outside of my genre and like, there's no real score to speak of, and I wouldn't want to even attempt, but so that's why I would put a Grindhouse movie up against Saw X just for fun.
That's a good fit, because they really are. They're artsy Grindhouse movies at the end of the day. Like,
there's grit on the screen and grain,
Yeah, it could fit in nicely with like the Pam Grier, like the women in prison kind of movies, and like those kind of really bizarre types of vibes.
I have a very low cheese meter. I can tolerate really, things which are lowbrow,
Yeah. My favorite is the ones where they're clearly trying really hard and there's accidental cheese. I have a low tolerance for like purposeful cheese, unless it's like they are trying to be like Austin Powers or something. But like some of the sci-fi stuff they crank out where it's like, okay, yeah, it's just Shark Exorcist or whatever. It's like, whatever. But I've been watching through a ton of old Italian like Fulci movies, and like there's some funny things with dubbing, but like the movies are just incredible. I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when they're going for the jugular, even if they miss the mark, I can still appreciate it.
It's a good time.
And like many of those like Pam Grier movies, like they look kind of homemade in some spots, like there's not like a cadre of Hollywood cinematic experts at the wheel here.
Right.
But their effort is sincere, and what they're trying to do was sincere, and like, it's not quite Ed Wood, good, bad, but there's an element of that which is charming, I think.
Right. Absolutely. last question for you. If you could give one piece of advice to anybody who is attempting to make it in filmmaking, an aspiring filmmaker, what advice would you give them?
Well, it's probably an old chestnut, but find your own sound or vision. And I will draw the analogy that, that's kind of what's gotten me everywhere that I've been through all my journey. And I'll admit that it's partly out of laziness and fear, because if I can look around at my contemporaries or the established people in the genre of creative work that I want to be involved in, and I can find people that are just absolutely killing it at what they do, and they've just got it so on lock, they're just nailing it, then I immediately, I never want to be on the freeway at night and seeing taillights in the distance that are getting further away. I don't want to be trying to catch up. If I was an aspiring cinematographer, I would study the work of Deakins, but I wouldn't want to emulate, and I would want to find a path around the side of those who have already established a direction and are absolute experts in their field. And that's why I don't sort of attempt to do, epic, heroic Marvel Avengers theme type of music or movies, because there's a million dudes that want to do that, and there's a dozen dudes that are just killing it, and you're up against people like Alan Silvestri, and good freaking luck. That's why I'm quite happy to have found this weird little corner of the film industry, and that the Saw movies have become their own little sub genre. But that process of being on the freeway and my foot's to the floor, but the peer group ahead of me is getting further away, my first reaction is to take my foot off the gas and to yank the wheel to the left. And if that means I'm crashing through the bushes at 5 miles an hour, and it's a tough journey and there's nobody on the road with me, because there is no road, that's kind of okay with me, because whatever destination I get to, I might be the first person to look out over that valley from that view. So those are the creative efforts that make their mark, are when someone is finding not only a new path, but a new destination. And that's why Quentin Tarantino's stuff was such a bolt from the blue when it first started appearing, and people thought, I've never seen a movie like this. Turns out you kind of have, but not assembled and put to, the things that he combines and the influences that he references weren't the established status quo. And all of those kind of things, whether it's a bold new take on science fiction movies, or whether it was even something as simple as the found footage approach from Blair Witch, which at the time was mind-bending. Those bold new efforts and finding new directions are what make a lasting impact, and can really let people carve a niche in whatever creative field they're endeavoring in.
Yeah, I love that advice, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and for giving me a little extra time to chat through this. It was fantastic, and maybe I'll see you when Saw 11 inevitably comes out. And
I can only hope so.
And no, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for sharing with my audience. I really, really appreciate it.
Of course, I love talking about this stuff. So anytime.